What's up, GDEX? In this presentation, we're going to be talking about how authors create engaging characters that readers and gamers all over the world love, and how the best characters actually aren't characters at all. They're curiously human. Hello there. My name is Michael Laron. I am the author of over 50 science fiction and fantasy novels, as well as some self-help books for writers. I've been writing since like 2012. I can't remember anymore. And I am a working science fiction and fantasy novelist. And it is one of the best things that I can think of in terms of I get to sit in a chair and make stuff up for a living, as a mentor once said. I get to make stuff up, and I get paid for it, and that is just one of my greatest pleasures in life. And I'm also a YouTuber, so I have a YouTube channel, and it's called Author Level Up. At the time of this recording, I've got close to 30,000 subscribers, and I do videos every single week, every Friday at noon, on how to be a better writer. So how to write better fiction, how to master the craft of fiction. And yeah, that's kind of why my videos are in the style that they're in. And I also have 3 different podcasts, if that weren't enough. And I have managed to be a writer and write science fiction and fantasy and do my YouTube channel and my 3 podcasts while working a full-time job as a consultant at a Fortune 100 insurance company, while raising a family. I've got a puppy, I've got a pet rabbit, I've got a beautiful wife, and I've got a 6-year-old daughter. And I've also managed to juggle a writing career while attending law school classes in the evenings. So I'm a pretty busy dude. I love it. It's just, it's what I like to do. And when I was invited to speak at GDEX, I was like, this is really cool, because I've never spoken at an event where so many of the people in the audience are gamers, because there's a soft spot in my heart for video games. I grew up playing video games, and my favorite series, the games I used to love to play, were JRPGs, like the Final Fantasy series, Chrono Trigger, Wild Arms. Wild Arms was one of my all-time favorites, and platformers like Jak and Daxter, Sly Cooper, Ratchet and Clank. I mean, those were my games, right? And so long time ago, very, very long time ago, I actually used to be a video game reviewer. I used to write for a RPG review site called RPGfan.com. They're still around. None of my reviews, I don't think, are on there anymore. But I actually used to review games. So like I got the Kingdom Hearts games ahead of time with the embargo stuff. So I was like one of the first people to play the Kingdom Hearts sequels. And I got to review video game music. I'm actually a very avid video game music fan. So I have probably close to 1,000 video game albums, and like Super Nintendo is my specialty, but I still follow all of the video game soundtracks that come out now. And so it's really cool to be here with you and talk about what I'm going to talk about. So I titled the name of this presentation, Curiously Human. I'm going to figure out what that sound is by the end of this video. Curiously Human. And this talk is, it's a personal experience. I'm not going to sit here and say that this is how everybody does it or how everyone should do it, but it's my personal experience on how to create engaging characters. And as I think about my journey as a gamer into the journey of becoming a writer, I look back on all my favorite games, all my favorite novels, all my favorite television shows, and I see that there were certain things that the authors did to help me get engaged with the characters. And so I want to talk about some of the things that I have learned over writing 50 books or so. And I promise that this will not be a technical talk. I'm a writer. As a writer, it's really easy for me to start getting into nuts and bolts of writing. And I recognize some of you out there may be writers. Some of you may be aspiring writers, which is super cool. But most of you are probably readers. And so I'm going to talk about the behind the scenes of how an author approaches a story, because I find that readers find that infinitely fascinating. And if you're a writer, we'll have a few things here that you can take away as well. I used to believe that there was a single way to write. Like, I used to think that there was a formula and you had to put all the elements in place with the formula. And if you didn't get that formula right, then people would come to your house with pitchforks and and all that. And I've learned that there is no right or wrong way to do anything in as a writer, and especially in life. But what I do want to talk about for the rest of this talk are four important concepts that I've learned that I use in my own fiction to make characters engaging and curiously human. Before we get into the first main idea, I want to talk about a concept that revolutionized things for me. There was a book I read years ago. It was called Creating Characters by Dwight V. Swain. And, it's kind of an old-fashioned book. I think it was written in like the 60s. You're not going to hear it mentioned by very many people. It's kind of one of those things where you're kind of lucky if you ever found it. So I picked this book up, and he had this really interesting idea in the book. And the core idea is that don't treat characters like characters. Instead, treat them like real people. And if you think about that, if you put a character on the page, it's really easy to make the character do whatever you want them to do, right? I mean, writers are kind of like gods. Game developers are kind of like gods. We can have our characters do whatever we want. And sometimes writers forget that characters are really just people at the end of the day. And people are subject to the laws of psychology, right? So if you're going to accept the premise that a character is like a person, then you also have to accept the premise that they're going to have to play by the laws of psychology. And that's where things start to get really interesting for me as an artist. So the first idea that makes your characters engaging, something that I have learned, it's kind of like an author's secret, is that a character has to have a foundation. And that foundation is what I like to call the ability to care. It's something that Swain talks about in his book. A hero has to have the ability to care. What the heck does that mean? Let me illustrate this with an example. Let's say that you have a newlywed couple, husband and wife. They just got married, and they just got back from their honeymoon, and the honeymoon phase is starting to wear off. And the husband is a neat freak. He's got to have everything a certain way. He's got to have the shelves organized. The garage has to be in tip-top shape, just super clean, neat freak. Now, the wife is not a neat freak. She leaves her clothes all over the floor. The kitchen is always a mess. The bedroom is always a mess. She doesn't clean up after herself. And this is a constant struggle between the husband and wife, because the husband cares about organization and order, but the wife doesn't care about that. She cares about other things. And so that creates friction, because you have two characters that care about something completely different. And because they don't care about the same thing, you've got friction. That is what great character work is all about. You've got a hero and maybe a supporting character, and there's that clash between them, right? Or you've got, in a romance novel, you have a heroine and a hero, and it's like the clash of the titans when they first meet for the first time. Now, one of my favorite RPGs of all time is Final Fantasy X. I remember when I first bought that game and I brought it home and I fired it up. I was just in seventh heaven playing that game. And in that game, we follow two characters. We follow Tidus, who's the main character, and then we have Yuna. And Yuna is a summoner, and her responsibility is to, with her guardians, travel to defeat this giant monstrosity called Sin. And in order to do that, she knows that she's going to have to sacrifice herself in order to save the world and stop Sin from ravaging the continent for a time. Well, Tidus doesn't agree with that. He's like, why would you have to sacrifice yourself? Let's beat the crap out of this monster. Let's destroy it without having to sacrifice a summoner. That's really stodgy. But Yuna believes in tradition. That is important to her because her father did the same thing. And this is what a summoner is expected to do in society. And Tidus, he's like this, ritzy, glitzy athlete who, all he believes in is right and wrong, and he has a rude awakening as he experiences this tradition. That's a great example in the world of games of how you can have two characters that have the ability to care about something completely different that causes friction in the plot. And that difference is what makes characters curiously human. The second idea that writers use all the time, and all you have to do is pick up your favorite book, and you will see this in action on almost every page, and that is writing through the five senses. This is probably the most basic tip that every writer learns, like on day one. There's no writer school per se, but if you went to a writer school, if there was such a thing, on day one or day two, you probably learn about writing in the five senses. And people hear that and they say, okay, duh. It's common knowledge. Well, why wouldn't you write in the five senses, right? But I've had to learn this on a deeper level over and over and over again. So let me give you an example. When you're writing in the five senses, it's not just enough to say the room smelled like this, or the character saw this, or the character felt this, or they tasted pizza, or whatever it is people put on the page. You've got to put the reader in the eyes of the character. A mentor taught me this once. Put the reader in the eyes of the character and have the reader see the world through the character's five senses. See, that is what makes the difference between flat fiction and fiction that's just like super, super cool. And I've learned to do this in many different ways. So I'll give you a personal example from one of my series. I have a series that's called The Last Dragon Lord, and it's about an evil, bloodthirsty anti-hero dragon lord who is overthrown because he's a brutal dictator, and the whole goal of the story is him seeking revenge against the conspiracy that overthrew him. And he's like one part Smaug from Lord of the Rings, one part Richard III from Shakespeare, and then another part like Francis Underwood from House of Cards. So he's kind of a brutal dude. And as I was writing the story, I was like, okay, this is a dragon. How would a dragon see the world? Like a dragon is not going to see the world the same as a human. Like if I think about a dragon, I think of a dragon as having very heightened senses. So maybe their eyesight isn't the greatest, but they can smell really, really good. And they have really, really good hearing. So if I was writing a scene in the perspective of my evil Dragon Lord character, I'm going to focus more on what he can smell and more on what he can hear, and I'm gonna focus less on what he can see, because that is what his reality is. That's how you have to think about it. And this principle is very similar in video games too. Like in games where you have multiple characters, this is why the developers make each character control differently, right? Like perfect example of this, one of my favorite games of all time is Sly 2, Band of Thieves. I know this makes me a little old school, but I don't play video games as much as I used to. In fact, I don't play them at all anymore. So I know I'm giving you old school examples, but that's how I roll. So Sly 2, one of my favorite games of all time, one of the best sequels of all time. You got three characters in that series, or in that game. You've got Sly, who's a thief, and he's super smooth. He can sneak around. He's fast. He's quick. He's really good fighting, and he controls a certain way. And then you've got Murray, who's Big Hippo. He's a fighter. You're not going to be sneaking around very much with Murray. Murray is a bull in a china shop. And he's great with brawls. And then you got Bentley, who's the turtle guy, and you don't want to send Bentley into too many fights because he's probably going to lose, but his brains make up for it, and he's got all these inventions that he can use, and he can be a little bit sneaky too. And so when you think about games, that's how developers can get around that too. The developers, you're not going to be able to smell anything through a video game, right? At least not yet. Maybe in like 50 years. and you just can't do that, and you can't taste anything. But the way a character controls is one way to very easily put the reader into, or the gamer into, the head of that character, which is really cool. And let me give you yet another example in a book of how a writer can do this, because this is like one of the most important concepts of the talk today. And let's take Harry Potter. All right, so Harry Potter, we got Ron, we got Hermione, and we got Harry. All right. What if we were to rewrite the entire Harry Potter series in the first person point of view? And we would have Harry narrate some chapters, Ron narrate his chapters, and Hermione narrate her chapters. How would an author approach it? How would J.K. Rowling approach this? Well, if you think about it, Harry, Ron, and Hermione are three completely different personalities. If you put them in a room and you have something happen, each of them is going to see it differently. In fact, each of them is going to experience it differently, and they're going to have different perspectives, right? So if I was writing a Harry chapter, I'd probably be more down to earth. I'd use simpler language. He would be enthralled and just in wonder about all the different things that he's seeing, because, you know, Harry is learning to become a wizard, and he's never seen any of these places before, and he would have a tinge of wonder in his chapters. Now, if I'm thinking about Ron is probably not going to be as observant as Harry. Now, I know I'm not going to knock on Ron, okay? Ron's not my favorite Harry Potter character, but I'm not going to knock on him today. Ron would be more street smart in the way he approached his problems. And if he was narrating in the first person, he'd probably talk about his family a lot. He'd probably talk about his family too much. And he'd probably be really sarcastic and really humorous, as opposed to Harry, who would be more serious in his narration. And then if we think about Hermione's going to be the smartest of the bunch. She's going to be super observant. She's going to see things that Harry and Ron won't see. She's going to have a very methodical way of thinking about her problems, and you're going to feel like you're in the mind of a genius when you're reading Hermione's chapters. That is another way that you can use the five senses and take this concept that no person is going to experience anything in the same way. And if you think about games and you think about books and you think about movies, that is how artists make their characters curiously human. The third concept that writers and artists and developers use all the time to make characters more engaging is this idea of what I like to call translating people onto the page. And one of the easy ways to do that is to be a student of people. So when I think about video games, I think about like motion capture. I think about things that the character does, maybe gestures that they make, or things that they might say that somebody might say in real life. And it makes them feel more real. And if you can learn to become a student of people as an artist, and you can learn to translate those micro gestures onto the page, if you've got a character that's got the ability to care, and they've got something that they believe in, you put the reader in their head using the five senses, and then you've got these little micro gestures that make them seem real and make them do things that the character or that a real person would do. Oh man, you are cooking with gas. Let me give you an example. So let me give you a real life example of how you can learn to do these micro gestures. So I work at an insurance company, and as with all buildings in the world, this insurance company has bathrooms. And the bathrooms are fine bathrooms. I mean, they've got toilets, they've got walls, they've got floors that are clean, but they have one deficiency. And that deficiency is the soap dispensers. They just don't like to acknowledge your existence. You wave your hand under it, and it just kind of looks the other way, And you got to wave your hand under it for like 5 seconds, and then finally, when it gives you some soap, you get like this little pebble of soap. It's like an insult to your existence. And so one time I was in the bathroom, and this executive walks in and goes to the bathroom, and then he goes to the sink, and he stands in the middle sink, and he puts out one hand and for one of the soap dispensers, because there's 3 sinks. And then he puts out the other hand to the other soap dispenser and puts his hands together and washes his hands, And I watched him do that, and I was like, huh, it's really interesting. Because the left soap dispenser sucks. The right soap dispenser sucks. But if you take the amount of soap from both of them, put them together, well, you got yourself a regular load of soap. And so I thought, that's really interesting. I wonder why he did that. Well, it was probably because he didn't have a whole lot of time. I mean, executives are pretty busy people, and he doesn't have time to stand in front of a soap dispenser and make sure it works. And so that is a really interesting micro gesture that you could put into a novel. So like if I wanted to write that onto the page, let's say I'm writing a detective novel, and I got a detective who is in a bathroom in the police station, and this bathroom in the police station, all the officers hate it because of these soap dispensers. And so he does the thing that I saw the executive do, and maybe he comments on the fact that he doesn't have time to play handsy with the sink because he's got to go out and catch a killer, And here's the interesting thing about these micro gestures. Yeah, okay, that's funny. It's interesting. It's weird. But you put that on the page, and then the reader thinks that you put the ball in the reader's court. Okay, so as I was probably telling the story, I bet you probably fell into one of two camps. The first camp is probably you're like, that's really weird. And then the second camp is probably, that's brilliant. I never thought about that before. And so you can imagine readers thinking the same thing on the page. By using a microgesture, you put the ball in their court to figure out how they feel about a certain gesture, about a certain thing that the character is doing. And sometimes, if you're good enough, you can get to a point where the reader thinks about something in their own life that's very similar. Maybe the reader does the same thing, or maybe they're like, hey, that's a great idea. I need to start thinking about that. And so that forces them to internalize what they've just read, which activates their humanity. I know that's a really deep statement. I don't mean it to be that deep, but you, by the virtue of putting these little black and white marks on a page, have just evoked something in the reader that makes them look inward and realize something about themselves that they didn't realize that they knew. That is another technique that writers use to make their characters curiously human. Now, the fourth interesting concept that writers use to make their characters more engaging is to follow the laws of relationships. So think about all the relationships in your life. You got your spouse, you got your friends, you got your family members, your coworkers, the people you play games with, the relationships. Now, I want you to think about your best friend, the person that you consider your best friend in the world. When you met your best friend for the first time, your best friend gave you a first impression, right? Maybe your first impression of your now best friend is that this person is weird. Or maybe your first impression was, this person is really interesting. I want to get to know them a little bit more. Or maybe you were completely turned off by your best friend because they came off as super arrogant or, whatever. But first impression is a first impression, right? And as you get to know people over time, you start to learn more about them and you take more of an interest in them. They take more of an interest in you, and slowly you learn about what makes them tick. And sometimes that first impression sets the tone for the friendship. Other times the first impression can be wrong, And that is exactly how writers approach characters too. All of your favorite best-selling writers, that's exactly how they do it. I think about a character like Harry Dresden from the Dresden Files. And your first impression of him is this wizard private eye who is just a tad bit grumpy. Well, that's Harry to a nutshell, right? I think about Harry Potter, it's this young, naive wizard, and he slowly grows into the wizard that he's meant to be. I think about characters like Nathan Drake, right? Makes a very strong first impression. I think about characters like Noctis from Final Fantasy 15, very strong first impression, and that is what it is. It's a first impression. And then you slowly get to figure out what makes that character tick over time. So if you start combining the other concepts that I talked about, wow, you've got a really interesting character. And it doesn't matter what type of character it is. You can have an anti-hero, you can have a shy hero, you can have some high school nerd who suddenly has to save the world. It doesn't really matter. These things are universal, and when you start thinking about these as a writer, you can do some really fun things. And when you start thinking about these things as a reader, you can be on the lookout for some really cool stuff. So let's put this all together. When we think about engaging characters that are something human. I'm not going to trigger the whatever that sound effect is. You think about characters that are engaging. First, they've got to have the ability to care. What is it that they stand for? What is it that makes them who they are? Second, the ability to put the reader in the character's head through the five senses. Third, the ability to translate the character onto the page using things like micro gestures. And four, abiding by the laws of relationships. Remember, if you have a character, you got to treat them like a real person. At least that's what I believe, is my experience. And you're going to have a real person, then they've got to follow the laws of psychology. And if you put all these things together, whether you're looking at a book, whether you're looking at a video game, whether you're looking at a graphic novel or a comic book or whatever, you have some things that are going to make characters curiously human. Okay, I got to figure out what that is. That's driving me crazy. Oh, it's my phone, and it's telling me that this talk is almost over. I forgot I changed my ringtone. Oh, don't throw tomatoes at me. Please don't throw tomatoes at me. But I did want to let you know that I have enjoyed this talk so much, and I hope that everybody is having a great time at GDEX, despite the fact that we can't be together in person. And I want to thank Chris, the organizer, for the invitation. I want to thank you for watching. And I also want to thank my video editor, Yaiko Gomez, who cut all this stuff together to make me look good and help me get my message out to you. So I've got some things that I would love to share with you if you would like to continue the conversation with me further. First things first, I am a fiction writer, so I would be remiss not to talk about my science fiction and fantasy. So I've got 3 series that I think you might love. And the first series is The Last Dragon Lord that I talked about. Bloodthirsty Dragon Lord seeking revenge against the conspirators that overthrew him. And it's got a killer audiobook version as well. You can find all of my fiction at michaellaron.com. The URL is on the screen. I've also got another series. It's called Modern Necromancy, and that is about a man who becomes a necromancer in order to reunite with his dead fiancée one last time. And in doing that, necromancy is a dark art, so yeah, he kind of unleashes hell on the world. And now it's suddenly his job to save it. And it is a fast-paced race around the world supernatural thriller that I wrote with a friend of mine that's got over 120 reviews on Amazon, and readers really like it. That's also available in audio too. And another series that I've got for my sci-fi readers out there, I've got a series called Android X, and that is about an android special agent whose job is to hunt down rogue androids in the year 2300. And it's kind of like he hunts down androids with his human engineer, and it's a buddy cop story in the year 2300, and it's a lot of fun. So again, you can check out my fiction at michaellaron.com. I've also got books for writers. If you happen to be a writer or if you happen to be an aspiring writer, you can check me out at authorlevelup.com. That's where you can find my YouTube channel, you can find my podcasts, and all the other things that I'm doing here on the interwebs. So again, thank you so much for watching. I wish you all the best. Stay well, stay safe, take care.